What's up, guys? Today we have Nick Fuentes debating Sidney Watson on women and authoritarianism.
Do you want to get married?
Yeah, I want to get married, but more out of necessity of like producing a male heir is really the whole point.
I love your face.
No, I'm just listening. I'm just observing. You can keep going. Continue.
She's like, we can keep going.
No, because I mean, I would prefer to get a handle on what you think from your mouth.
That's very
before
Chinese
I
of
say
him, though.
anything.
You know, just only men. So he doesn't want any female children. It's very Chinese.
Yeah, no, I think they're awake on this question. You know, I mean, as far as like marriage
Well, it's more
goes,
about population control there rather than, getting
well,
rid
and
of
it's
women.
like the old world stuff about like a dowry and like, gendered stuff and all that. But, at least for me, it's sort of like a pride thing. Like I want to produce a male heir to take on my name, take on my legacy and all that. And, marriage is sort of pursuant to that goal. But, I don't know about this whole prospect of like living with a woman for the rest of my life. Like, it sounds good at first. It sounds like kind of fun or interesting. You don't have to do laundry. You don't have to worry about kind of taking care of the house. But, then the prospect of just like it goes on and on and on. And it's decade after decade after decade. And, I don't know how thrilled I am with that whole idea. I'm kind of a solitary individual. I like my privacy. I like my autonomy, and just the idea of like nagging GF, nagging wife. It's a little nightmarish to me.
Do you have a good relationship with your mom?
I love my mom. Yeah, I love my mom.
Mm-hmm. Is your mom a stay-at-home mom? What does she do?
Yeah, so she works now, but when me and my sister were growing up, she raised me. She quit her job to stay at home and raise us.
And what's your
full
sister
time.
like? Do you get on with her?
Yeah, she's my twin. She's probably the opposite of me. She's more calm, sort of introverted. Yeah, but we get along.
Do you respect women?
Of course.
But you just don't want them to have any rights.
Well, I didn't say that. I didn't
Okay.
say they shouldn't have rights.
But if I'm understanding your question correctly, if you don't want them to vote or drive or have an existence akin to what they would have in, say, Saudi Arabia, you would say that in large part, then they don't really have rights.
Well, I would say probably the ideal is something more like Afghanistan, if I'm being totally honest. Like
And
recent,
so what's the difference
recent
between
Afghanistan.
then and Saudi Arabia?
Like the brutality, I guess. It's like a little, slightly more brutal. Of course, Taliban rule, not American rule. I'm talking about, recent Afghanistan.
So you want women to have the same treatment as women have under Taliban rule in Afghanistan?
Something approximating that, yeah,
Okay.
because, you think about the Taliban and, what they're able to achieve. Here you have these guys with nothing but, some light arms and rags and 20 years, and they were able to defeat the largest military in history. I think that has something to do with the fact that they weren't, like, distracted. They weren't distracted with the kinds of things we are in America. They weren't being nagged. They weren't being bossed around by women. And, now they've got this society where there's this brutality, like I said, this old world sort of order. And you bring up like voting. I don't see really voting as a right, if I'm being totally honest. Like, it's not just women. There's a lot of people that really shouldn't be voting anymore.
Such as?
Maybe people that don't own property, young people that work like retail jobs. Like, as an example, really? Well,
No,
hear me
that's
out.
just
Hear me out.
funny. People that work retail jobs.
Well,
Okay,
or
we
like
can, I think we
service
can all get
jobs.
on board with that national movement. It's like, with the service that you're getting, it's like, man, you couldn't even get my change right. I don't know if you're going to be able to pick the correct president of the United
I was
States.
in Lowe's earlier, and a young man helped me who's actually a fan of both of us, who was super lovely, and I would like him to vote. He was great. He was very clever.
Well, the thing about retail or these service jobs is like, you look at these young people, it's a lot of millennials, Generation Z, and they really don't know how things work. You know what I mean? Like if you own a business, if you own property, even if you're a homeowner, you kind of have an idea of like how things work, like where things come from and some idea of like how the economy works. And, if your whole life is like, okay, you're in school, you're a student, you pay rent. You know what I mean? Like you don't even manage like how your apartment runs. Like how should you have a say in how the country is run? You don't even really know how anything comes together in society. So, the old way in America was that it was, of course, propertied white men. It was a very narrow group of people that were able to vote. And that's because the founding fathers didn't really believe in mass democracy, universal suffrage. They believed in checks and balances, and kind of voting was a part of like checking the power of the ruling class or the regime with the power of the people. But they weren't under any illusions about this idea that like every person should have a vote. One man, one woman, one child, one vote. They didn't believe that. So, that's not how the country was founded. That's not how the system was set up. And that was for a reason. So I think it was a big mistake in the past 100 years to just open it up to everybody. We have to think about how we're going to have competent government and who's going to make those choices. And, we have to think competent people should be making those choices.
If I were to ask you, let's start with rights. Okay, let's start with access to something very simple. Let's go to an amendment. Let's go to 19th Amendment. Right? Let's start there. Let's just start there.
Gone.
All right.
Gone.
All right.
Day
What do you
one.
thought? All right. Day one gone.
It shouldn't be there. It
I have a
shouldn't be
question, though. Have you ever lived in any other country besides the United States?
Nope.
Okay,
Just
so
America.
when you talk about many of these things, these are just from an observational standpoint where you've done a lot of reading and observed a bunch of things.
Yes.
And then arrived at your conclusions based on that.
Yes.
But you have no practical experience living under, say, a more authoritarian rule.
No. Well, I already live under something like authoritarianism in America. I'm on the no-fly list. I'm being persecuted. The thing is about authoritarianism is it can't be condemned in itself, because the character of the regime isn't really authority. The authority is colored by the people that are in authority.
Not to interrupt you, sorry, but just to back up for a second. So you're currently on a no-fly list based on the authoritarianism that's going on in the country.
Right.
Now, that authoritarianism, you could argue, is from the left, and the left are very happy that they have that authoritarianism. So what you want is right-wing authoritarianism.
Yes.
But your issue is with left-wing authoritarianism.
The problem is not authoritarianism. The problem is leftism.
What about the people on the left who think of you and go, well, I don't want to live under his rule of law? Because obviously there are people who don't think like you do.
This is
We're
the
not a
essence
monolith.
of politics. This is the essence of politics, is that there is an us and there is a them. There
Sure.
are right-wing people and there are left-wing people, and people have varying identities with different levels of salience. But yes, the problem is that we are not in control of the regime. Ultimately, the problem is not the regime itself or power, because the thing is, and this is the problem, is that conservatives are sort of naive about power. Power, is not, we're not getting rid of it anytime soon. This idea of take over the government to let everybody go and free the people. It's like there will always be concentrated, centralized power. And the question is, well, who's going to wield it? Are we going to forfeit the playing field to the left? This is essentially what conservatives have done because they're averse to rule. When conservatives get in control of Congress or the presidency, what do? Do they go aggressively like the left does and wield the bureaucracy and wield the Congress? Or do they kind of just, well, we're going to cut your taxes and we're going to do this and that. And then the left comes in with a vengeance and they say, we're going to use environmental regulations to take your gun rights. And we're going to use the IRS to go after conservative nonprofits. And we're going to do this and we're going to solidify our rule. And then we are going to set the tone for the country. And conservatives then, even when Trump gets into office, it's like, what did we accomplish in the first 2 years? When we had Congress, we had the courts, we had the White House, we did a corporate tax cut, barely repealed Obamacare. That's about it. We should have built a wall. We should have went after the endowments for the universities. We should have targeted left-wing institutions. We should have opened up the libel laws and went after the media. So, conservatives just aren't playing the game. We've got to wake up to the reality of power politics, engage and play. And so back to the original point, the problem is not that there is power, that there is authority. There will always be authority. There has to be authority. The question is who is going to wield it. And, right-wing people have to do that, which is why I said earlier, if Trump became the Caesar of America, hypothetically, if he had got in 2016 and said, you know what, I'm not leaving. And the courts tell me that I have to leave, well, I'll disobey them. And he went full, Andrew Jackson, I would support it. I wouldn't say, this is authoritarianism. This is in principle wrong. I would say, this is a right man for the job. This is a rightful ruler of America. And, and I would be okay with that.
You bring up Caesar, but didn't that end pretty poorly for them?
No, the empire.
The empire ended pretty poorly, I think.
Yeah, after hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Well, we've been around for about 400. How many we got left?
Well, I don't know. That's just it. The Roman Republic was around, and then it gave birth to a true empire ruled by a Caesar, and then they reached their zenith under the empire. So I don't necessarily think that's the worst thing in the world.
I just find it interesting, though, that you're promoting these ideas having not ever lived under them. I just find that that's such a it's odd to say let's paint the entire house blue when you've never seen a blue house.
Well, do I need to go to Russia to?
Yes, probably. Probably.
Why? I mean, why?
I mean, I'll give you an example. A very good friend of mine who I've known for about 10 years used to be very much like you, actually. And he, he's someone who used to really, really prop up authoritarianism. He used to, and he still believes this in part, that people do need to be governed to a large extent because people, left alone are morons. And that's not saying necessarily that I even disagree with. I think your average person is probably as dumb as a bag of rocks. However, he moved to Singapore, which you could argue is not the worst place in the world. Obviously, it's quite clean. People, follow the law. The crime rate is reasonably low. But after about 2 years of living in Singapore, where they knock on your door, and this has happened to him, where he got dobbed in by his neighbors for having water on his balcony, and they said it's causing a mosquito problem. Now we're at your house, prepared to fine you over mosquitoes. He said to me, I hate living in this country. I hate the authoritarianism here. I hate the way that things operate, because coming from Australia, he's an Aussie. He was like, I much prefer the way that we do things back home, or at least, the freedom that we have. And living in a country where that's staunched in some capacity was really, and is and continues to be, very bothersome and trying for him. And so I just find it interesting, though, that you've only ever lived in the United States. I just you can only do so much reading before practical experience actually should take, some sort of...
Yeah, so guys, authoritarianism is wrong because a friend of Sidney Watson and the police come to knock to his door because of mosquitoes. Like, what the fuck? Bro, we have so many Karens in Europe, America. That doesn't mean it's authoritarianism, People call the police all the time for stupid things. And not only that, you have to thank democracy if Europe, USA, Canada, Australia, all these first world countries are being invaded and destroyed. So I don't think authoritarianism is really the problem. But guys, let me know in the comments what you think.
The same thing about women too. I mean, I dare say, from my understanding of many of your viewpoints, you also promote the way of interacting with women. And I go, have you been in a relationship with a woman?
No.
So how are you telling other people how to behave towards women when you yourself have not had any actual physical, interaction with them in a romantic capacity, or in fact in any capacity where you uphold them in a way that treats them with respect? I mean, if you're out here arguing that women are basically half the value of, well, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, in fact, because that's not right. But, if you are looking to some other regimes around the world that do think that women are half the value of a man, I have to question what kind of a person who's had no experience with women is in a position to basically promote these ideas.
Well, I'm having an experience with a woman right now, and I've had lots of experiences with women in my life, not romantically per se, but I've talked to enough women. I've been in, I've known enough women to know sort of what's going on. And I think any man who is observant enough, and honestly, like I said, we could go back to great geniuses. We could go back to people that have been in relationships. Like a perfect example is like the pickup artists. Have you ever noticed that pickup artists who have the most relationships with women and the most sex, what they say is that really with women, it's the same bag of tricks to seduce a woman or whatever. And I think that kind of tells you something about the nature of women, that, you go from woman to woman, and it's the same kind of like little tricks, little things you could say or whatever to kind of hack them and whatever. And I think that kind of says it all about their nature. So,
what does it say about our nature, Nick?
Well, it says that, they're not fully rational. I don't believe that, like men, they possess a sort of full rationality. I think that...
rationality towards what, specifically?
Well, rationality
just
entirely,
generally?
sort of objective. Yeah, I don't think they're capable of that. I think that, a male has a real impersonal sense of rationality and reason. I think that a female sense is far more personal. And, that derives from the fact that women are made to bear children. Women are made with their wombs to bear children. And so I think their whole consciousness is basically, it's wrapped up, it's bound up in this idea that they've got to carry a child and then raise a child. And I think that the impersonality, rationality, objectivity suffers from this. But in any case, to get back to the original question, which is about experience, I don't think that I need to live in Russia to know that we would rather have right-wing people running America than left-wing people. I think that's kind of an asinine sort of thing, which people like to trot out, and they say, well, you haven't, we could qualify it with all kinds of things, but the way that we live in America is unacceptable. I mean, there's homeless people everywhere. The crime's out of control. It's a corrupt country. it's a failing country, and you know,
Plenty
we
of
want to have
countries,
competent
Nick, around
leadership.
the world that have right-wing leadership still have many of those issues, and in fact, they're exacerbated oftentimes by the governments that are in power. So, and I would say too, I mean, I think it's a bit of a straw man to say that what I'm arguing here. I'm not even arguing. I'm just posing questions, really, because I'm interested to hear your viewpoints. However, I'm not saying. I mean, I agree with you in the sense that we should have, you know, right-wing leadership. I'd prefer to live under a right-wing government, you know, so to speak. Although I am more on Eric's side of things these days, where I'm edging closer and closer towards anarchism. But, you know, I'm not suggesting that I would rather a left-wing government over a right-wing one. I'm simply saying, having never lived under the autocratic rule that you seem to be promoting in some capacity, I'm having a hard time understanding how you can say that this would be the best way to go about doing things when you actually have no practical experience. That's all
Where
it
do
is.
we see? I'm wondering
That's
right
all
now,
I'm
but where,
saying.
but where do we see Christ-based, like, theocratic? I think isn't that more of what you're for? Is like more
Yeah.
like a
Theocracy?
monarchy? Like,
No, you're talking about
like,
theocracy.
No, but not necessarily just theocracy. But I'm just saying, like, in some way with authority.
Like
I'm
Iran.
I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
You mean like
Yeah.
the divine right of kings?
But I'm
Yes.
saying that's Muslim. Yeah, but like a Christian version of, let's just say, yeah, maybe a Christian version of Iran, but not the exact government system. I'm just saying, like, where do we actually see that? Because I could just be sounding like an idiot here, but I don't know if we have any of that sanctified or left
No.
in its own original state of like a Christian autocratic type of rule. Do we have that?
Nah,
I don't know
that
where
can
we have
think
it.
of. Not
Like,
not
on a
in
large
this day
scale,
and age.
like,
Not in this day and age.
Like Poland, kind of, but not really. Like, that's
It's
what I'm
more
saying.
like Hungary. More like Hungary would be more comparable because, you know, Viktor Orban, who's not perfect, but he's very good. You know, in Hungary, he articulated, I think a few years ago, he gave a speech at a university and talked about a new Christian nationalism in Europe as opposed to, you know, other forms of nationalism or other kinds of democracy, and articulated, and it's not quite, you know, what I'm talking about, a sort of autocratic rule inspired by religion, but it's a closer approximation of that. But you're right, we don't really have that. And is this a symptom of modernity? Is this liberalism? It's probably been, you know, 100 years since we've had any kind of meaningful Christian autocratic rule anywhere in the world. And, you know, all you have to look at is the experience of history. You know, this experiment of overthrowing the kings and overthrowing the gods, it's been a complete disaster. I mean, think about how Europe and America used to be 100 years ago. I mean, it's no contest compared to the kind of scum and degeneracy and the awful things that we see today.
Yeah.
And all that we want is a restoration of that. And I'm a real conservative in the sense that I don't believe that we're going to get to heaven on this side of death, right? So I don't know that we're going to get to I don't know. We're not going to have a perfect society, but it's a question of what kind of a society are we going to live in? What kinds of problems do we want? Do we want to have the excesses perhaps of a Christian autocratic rule and sometimes the cruelty or things that come with that? Or do we want to live in the environment we live in now where mankind is killing itself? You know, people
Yeah.
are not having children and it's sickness and depravity and children are being harmed and corrupted. I mean, I don't think it gets very much worse than where we are today. Outside of some exceptional circumstances in history. So to me, that's really it's about what kind of society, what's the character of the country we want to live in.
Yeah, I completely agree with Nick. I mean, if we want change, we have to change. And what's really the other option? Like, keep doing what we're doing is only gonna get worse. But guys, let me know in the comments what you think. If you agree or disagree, leave a like and subscribe if you want to. Christ is King, and God bless.